Hello my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day and welcome to this Frame Quilting Friday video. So last week I got this quilt basted up and on the Longarm, and I started this quilt quilting it on my home machine, and now I've moved it to the Longarm so that way I can quilt it faster. And I want to be able to match up with that original quilting design and get back to it. So in this video it's going to be a lot of careful stitching as I try and match up with what I did before and use rulers to help guide the machine and stitch that same design. It's going to be challenging because some of what I created is a little bit big for this frame, so I might have to stitch part of a line and then advance the quilt and then stitch the rest of it. So I'm going to really have to just play and be careful, and that's what this video is going to be all about. So let's get started. So I'm getting started here on this little square, and I needed to stitch, basically echo ditch around it. So I'm using my ruler as a guide, and it looks like I've overshot ever so slightly. That's not a big deal. I'm going to just simply stitch back gently into the center. Now I reached this point and I realized that on the other side over here I had stitched straight lines coming out and matching up with this line over here. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to estimate my space. I'm lining up my ruler and I'm estimating a 1/4 inch away from the ruler on that edge. I'm going to press firmly and stitch over. I'm aiming to hit that point. What's nice is there's a few seam lines here where I know if I run right through the center of that point, then I know I'm on the right track. Okay, so some of these lines were stitched accurately, some of them were not, so sometimes I can just use my ruler just to simply guide the straight line, and that's a-okay, even if the 1/4 inch isn't exactly accurate. So there we go, that's working out okay. Oop, my ruler slipped a little bit because that was a really awkward angle. I'm going to try to avoid that next time. Not going to rip it out though. This is definitely a learning quilt, an experiment quilt. I want to see if I can match up with this design. And I also need to check in on what I did before, and it looks like I had 3 lines spaced a 1/4 inch apart, and then I spaced a line 3/4 of an inch out. So what I'm going to do is just stitch just a little bit further right there, move my ruler, and I have, how this is designed is you have etched lines here on the back of the ruler. You want that to be face down so that way the etched lines are closest to your quilt. And I am using the line that is 2 from the edge, and that is going to add, in addition to the 1/4 inch on the ruler foot, that's going to be a 3/4 inch spacing. So there we go. Stitch straight across. And as you can see, this is just a little on the slow side, a little on the persnickety side, because I'm trying to match up and copy basically the design that I did in the first set of blocks when I was quilting this on my home machine. And it's not the easiest design, it's pretty complicated, so I'm just going to take my time and work slowly. So here we go, I'm back to that echo ditching. I'm going to back up and then go forward again, and it looks like, well, if I stitch one more line out where I should, which is about, well, it'd be spacing out another line here, I will end up over here and I'll be kind of stuck, and I'll have to travel stitch all the way back in order to complete these lines. So I think I'm going to complete these lines and then work my way into the center. So a little bit of this also is, you know, kind of just figuring out the path, which, you know, whenever you have an established design and you're trying to figure out the most efficient way of stitching it, that can be a little tricky. And sometimes I just stop and run my finger over the quilt. That's a-okay. There's no rule that says that you have to continuously stitch and never stop. You know, you need to stop and take breaks and stop and check in on the quilt and make sure that everything is going right. So there we go. Now I'm going to travel stitch, which is so nice. Straight lines are really easy to travel stitch whenever I have the rulers as a guide. When I don't have the rulers, I am all over the place. I just don't have that control yet. But I do find that the more I quilt on the Longarm, and yes, definitely the more I force myself to quilt freehand, the more control that I end up having. So I think it's all good. All practice is all good. There we go. All right, let's see if I've spaced out my lines well enough to do that 3/4 inch spacing, and I have. That looks good. Just press firmly. Let's see here. Now I have the machine on regulated precise, and I have my stitch length set at 16 stitches per inch. And I like that. That to me is a really nice stitch. It's nice and tight. It's what I aim for on my home sewing machine where I don't have a stitch regulator. So that's what I always set up my machine to be, especially when I'm doing ruler foot quilting. I always use regulated precise. All right, so that looks good. I'm really pleased with that. Now in the center here, I used the mini slide ruler to quilt some curves. And what I did before, here's a picture of it. I aimed to place my ruler 1/4 inch from the center so that way I could kind of stitch from that point to that point with a nice curve. So I need to get myself down here so I can stitch that. So again, I'm going to line up and travel stitch carefully all the way down. And this is really just a matter of kind of estimating with the ruler. I'm going to get to this point, I'm going to switch rulers, and actually I think I'm going to come from this angle because that is easier for me to see, and I am holding this with my non-dominant hand. I'm left-handed, so I'm holding this with my right hand, and this angle is just really awkward for me, so I'm going to go this way. And what I'm doing here is I am estimating space from that edge of the ruler to that point, and I want that to come in 1/4 inch away. So I'm just going to back that off a little bit, turn on the machine, and let it go. And that's going to create that nice curve. Now, one other thing that I was lining up too that you might not have noticed, this center line in the middle of the ruler, that's telling you it's in the midpoint. I was trying to line that up roughly with the center too, so that way I know that curve is reaching its apex right there in the middle of that whole space. So little thing, but you know, sometimes it's nice to make sure that things match up nicely. So now I'll travel stitch a little bit more. And when I'm travel stitching like this, I'm aiming to get the edge of my foot in line with the edge of the stitching, that line of stitching I did before. There we go. Stitch across. Very good. And now I'm going to use the short end of that ruler to travel stitch. And again, we're going to actually, this time we're going to do 1/2 inch spacing. So I'm aiming to leave 1/2 inch between the edge of my ruler foot and that curving line beforehand. And now I'm lining up that curve one from the edge. This looks good. And stitch on down. Whoop. Well, I'm running into that straight line right there. So let's travel stitch. I realize I'm kind of looking at what I'm doing, and then I'm also looking at the other area where I've already quilted, and then I'm realizing, oh, okay, that is what I did before. So this is really, this is really weird. All right, here we go. Now I'm going to just finish this off. One little line right here, and it looks like I did just a little bit. I'm going to try this freehand. I'm going to try travel stitching and just one little line. Okay, that actually worked out pretty good. So see how, you know, just a little bit of practice and getting used to holding the ruler, I think that really does help you gain more control over where the machine is going. And then when I start to feel like I'm losing that control, that's when I grab the ruler and press it against the foot and get that little bit of control back in. There, I kind of lost it right there. That's okay, not the biggest deal. The nice thing is this is such a really, really bright quilt. If my stitching is off and, you know, I'm stitching with white thread here, I can always color that in with a red permanent magic marker, and that's okay. So, you know, sometimes when you use white thread, you can use that to your advantage, and any mistakes that you make, you just use a magic marker that's color safe to color it in. I realize I actually need to back up again. I need to get to this point so the needle's in that spot to stitch across, so that way I have the same curve. So this is one of those things. I think when you're trying to match up with something you've done before, you just really have to focus in on what you're doing. I'm trying to talk and stitch at the same time, and it's a little distracting, and that's a little bit of a struggle. So I have to just stop and check in and double check myself. It's kind of that rule in woodworking, you know, measure twice, cut once. We should also have that rule in quilting too. And this is, you know, check your ruler, check your stitching twice, and then stitch it once. So that way I don't have to rip it out if it's not quite right. Now this one isn't matching up quite as beautifully as the other side. I'm not too worried about that. This is taking far less time. I think it took me over an hour or two to stitch the same number of lines on my home machine, because this is a relatively large baby quilt. It has minky on the back, which is very grippy, and I was quilting this with rulers, but it was just not going very quickly. So for all of those reasons, it just seemed like a cool quilt to move to my long arm. And now I'm going to try, this is kind of interesting. So I stitch that line and I want to echo it, but really the most comfortable way to put the ruler is right here. So I'm just kind of visually doing this. Probably if I was aiming to do this, you know, just really exactly, I probably would have put the ruler on the other side, but that worked. That worked a-okay. So again, I think this is a matter of more practice equals more control. No matter if you are practicing and using rulers a lot, or you're practicing and doing everything freehand. So there we go. I am super pleased with that. That is not, I mean, it's close enough where I think if you did not know which was which, you might not know which one was stitched on a long arm or stitched on a home machine. So I think that's pretty cool. Now I'm going to travel stitch out and see where I'm going to go next in this design to keep it going. So I advanced the quilt through the machine and I want to continue this design, and that means that I need to do some echo ditching around this 9 patch. So to get myself over here across the space, I'm lining up my ruler so the edge is 1/4 inch from that spot, from that join of those seams. So now I'm going to stitch across, and then I'm going to stop when the edge of the foot is right up against those seam lines, so that way I can do my echo ditching. Now this is one of those tricky things. I'm not quite sure if the quilt is advanced far enough so that I can quilt all the way around this. So I may have to stop and advance the quilt just a little bit more if I need to. This is one of those things, you know, on a home machine you don't have to worry about how much space you have to quilt in. You can quilt the entire quilt, you know, moving it through the machine fluidly. On a long arm you have a limitation of how wide your frame is, of how much space you have within your long arm to work in, and that is limited by the size of your long arm. I'm working on the Grace Unique 14 Plus or 15R, and we've got about 15 inches of space in that arm. Of course, the quilt takes up a little bit of room on the bar, and then I also have a ruler plate on the machine as well, and that takes up a little space too. So all of those things start to reduce the amount of space that you have to quilt in, and so I have found that I can comfortably quilt about a 10-inch block, 10 inches of space. If I try and start to push that beyond that, then I usually run into trouble. So I watch out for that. Here we go. As you can see, all I'm doing here with this echo ditching is lining up the edge of the ruler with the edge of that foot, pressing firmly, and stitching all around. So that went super quick. Now I'm going to travel stitch back. I'm going to do that straight line quilting just the same way that I did before, lining up with that straight line that I first stitched. Go across. Now travel stitch up just a bit. Let's see if I can do that freehand. Ooh, look at that. That's excellent. Okay, and then now I'm lining up with the etched line 2 from the edge. So I have a 3/4 inch spacing. That looks great. Now I will travel stitch with a little assistance all the way around and stitch the same way over here. So yeah, this is, well, this is a fairly tedious design, I gotta admit. You know, that was just my choice, whatever I was coming up with, kind of on the fly on my home sewing machine, and I picked a pretty persnickety section quilting style design. Section quilting means that you're looking at the quilt and you're kind of going, okay, some lines over here and a little design over here and a little design over here. So you're picking and choosing different designs or different textures for each section. And it's a time-consuming style. It really is. And I just made a mistake. And, you know, this is one of those things. I'm focusing more on the quilt and not so much on the quilting. And you can see what I've established up to this point is 3 lines going across, then a spacing of 3/4 of an inch, and then another line. Well, here I just went and stitched another 1/4 inch line. So I'm going to need to pick that out. But so far I can definitely say this is working, and I am super pleased with how it's looking. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot, and you can see that it doesn't matter if you start on a home machine, you can move a quilt to a long arm, you can match up with that design, and I honestly can't tell the difference. I mean, my travel stitching is probably not quite as perfect on the long arm as on my home machine, but really it's the same design. I'm matching up, I'm using the rulers to guide and space those lines and create those designs. And I think it's looking great. I'm really excited about finishing up this baby quilt. It is going to be slightly more time consuming because I picked a really intricately spaced and organized design. And I'd say, you know, if you're in a hurry, this style of, you know, stitching around things, echo ditching, putting designs in certain spaces, that's called section quilting, and that is always going to be a more time-consuming style. It is paying attention to the piecing. It is trying to accent the piecing rather than just covering it up. So this is going to be a slow process, but that's okay. My goal was to finish this quilt this month, so I'm going to continue to knock out this quilting design, and next week I'm going to come up with something kind of funky and fun for the borders. I think I want to practice quilting feathers, and I think feathers would be a great accent for all of these straight lines. I got a few curves in there, but really this is a very straight line design. So I'm thinking adding nice curving, flowing feathers to the border is going to be the perfect way to finish it off. So I hope that you'll come and join me for that next week. You can find lots of Frame Quilting Friday videos at leahday.com/frame. You can also come and check out the Grace Unique 14 Plus or 15R and the Continuum quilting frame that I am stitching on. I really love this machine. I really love this frame, and I think it's a great deal for what you get and how it's able to help you quilt your quilts. So come and check it out at leahday.com/frame. Until next time, let's go quilt.